Today we're reading The Travels of Marco Polo. One of the most engrossing travel books ever written is over 700 years old. The Travels of Marco Polo is a true account of a young Venetian's adventurous life. Although it was written so long ago, you can probably find a copy of it on the shelves of your neighborhood library. So here we're reading all about Marco Polo, who he was, what he did, and why we're still reading this book to this day. Marco Polo was only 17 when his adventures began. In the year 1271, he left his native Venice for the Chinese court of Kublai Khan, the absolute ruler of most of Asia. He accompanied members of his family who were employed in the service of Kublai Khan. They were now returning to China after a visit home. The journey took the Venetians 4 years. So here at our beginning, we see Marco Polo, who's only 17. Him and his family go all the way from Venice in Italy to China, right, to the court of Kublai Khan, who his family was working for. So now they're returning to China. They visited home and they're going back to China. And it takes about 4 years for them in that time because 1271, that's a long, long time ago. It took them that long to go from one place to the other. The immense Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan had been founded 50 years earlier by the emperor's grandfather, Genghis Khan. One of the most feared tyrants in history, Genghis Khan had vanquished most of his challengers in Asia. Kublai Khan, by contrast, was a wise and benevolent ruler. He soon determined that Marco Polo was an exceptionally intelligent young man. Marco Polo was discreet as well. He could be trusted with information that the emperor hesitated to share with others at the court. Furthermore, because Marco Polo planned to return to Venice later, he was unlikely to intrigue against the emperor. For these reasons, Kublai Khan trusted Marco Polo as his ambassador to travel extensively throughout Asia, carrying out important missions. So, we have Kublai Khan, right, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the most feared tyrant in history, so he was a very scary person who took over other places very easily and with violence. But on the other side of this, we had Kublai Khan, his grandson, who was now the ruler, who was very benevolent, right? The people liked him. He treated everybody in a good way, not like his grandfather. So he really liked Marco Polo and saw that he was very trustworthy, that he was very smart, and that he wouldn't use any information against Kublai Khan or against his territory because Marco Polo planned to go back to his home later. So then he decided to make Marco Polo the ambassador to travel extensively throughout Asia. Right? So Asia is very, very large, right? The territory that Kublai Khan had conquered or had control of was very, very large. So Marco Polo had this really great opportunity to go all throughout Asia doing missions for the emperor. After 17 years, Marco Polo grew homesick. He yearned for his native Venice. However, he could not depart without the emperor's permission. Kublai Khan held his young advisor in high esteem and had rewarded him with significant positions in his court. Naturally, he was reluctant to relinquish the services of such a valued friend and advisor. But finally, the emperor gave his consent. In 1295, after a journey that lasted 3 years, Marco Polo arrived back in Venice. So 17 years later, Marco Polo wants to go back home, but he needs Kublai Khan's permission to do that. He was really useful. He was a good advisor, a good friend to Kublai Khan, so he really didn't want to send him home. But then later, the emperor told him, okay, you can go back to Venice. So after a 3-year journey, Marco Polo ended up back in his home. He soon became a celebrated figure because of the stories he related of his travels. Many of his Venetian listeners thought he must be exaggerating. They thought he was stretching the truth to make it sound more exciting. The things he claimed seemed to be too fantastic to be believed. But in fact, Marco Polo was telling the truth. He had observed creatures with huge jaws and sharp teeth that could swallow a person whole, crocodiles. He had seen black stones that, when ignited, burned with a great heat, coal. And he had witnessed many other marvels. So he saw so many amazing things that the Venetians had never seen before that he became famous telling his stories. 3 years after his return, Marco Polo was taken prisoner when hostilities broke out between Venice and Genoa, both Italian city states. The year he spent in captivity gave him the opportunity to dictate his travel adventures to a fellow prisoner. The book that eventually resulted became one of the most popular and widely translated literary works ever written. For hundreds of years, it has been entertaining readers all over the world. So once he got back, after a few years, he was in Venice, and there was hostility, some fighting that broke out between these two Italian city states. So he ended up in captivity in prison. So it gave him the opportunity to tell his stories to someone who he was in prison with, and that turned into a book later. Now that you can still read today, maybe if you go to your local library. Thank you for reading with me today. We do have links that are related to each video here. If you want the links related to this story, you can find it down in the description below.